Hello. My name is Jennifer Eberhardt. I'm a professor at Stanford and the author of Biased. It's an honor to be here this afternoon to share my work. Just recently, the Pew Research Center released a report showing that 6 in 10 Americans believe that race relations in this country are generally bad. And a majority of Americans fear that things are getting worse. They fear that we're slipping back in time. As a nation, we're struggling to hang on. I wrote this book, Bias, to speak to this struggle. In this book, I take readers on a journey. I take them into neighborhoods and schools and workplaces and police departments and courtrooms. And at each stop along the way, I light up the way bias operates. I explain how it affects our vision and our choices and our actions, even when we're not aware of it. I blend the science of bias with the stories of people who are affected by it. I start the book with a story that I'd like to share with you this afternoon. Some years ago, I was on an airplane with my son, who was 5 years old at the time. And my son was so excited about being on this airplane with mommy. He's looking all around and he's checking everything out and he's checking the people out. And he says to me, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy and he doesn't look anything at all like my husband, nothing at all, right? So then I start to look around on the plane and I noticed he was the only black man on the plane. And so I thought to myself, okay, I'm gonna have to have a little talk with my son about how not all black people look alike, right? So I'm saying, all right, so I was trying to adjust the language, right, to make it appropriate to lecture a 5-year-old. And before I started to lecture him, I thought, children are different from adults. They don't see the world in the same way. They haven't been conditioned year after year to see things in only certain ways. And so I thought, well, maybe there is some resemblance between this guy and my husband that I just can't see, but my son can, right? So I decide I'm gonna give it a shot, right? So I look at this man and I'm looking for any resemblance to my husband. So first I look at his height and there is no resemblance there. He's about 4 inches shorter than my husband. I look at his weight, no resemblance there. I looked at his facial features, nothing. I looked at his skin color, nothing. I looked at his hair. And this guy has long dreadlocks flowing down his back. And my husband shaves his head. And I thought, all right. I look at my son, I'm like, you're gonna get the talk, right? So I'm all ready to give him the talk. But before I could say anything, my son, he looks up at me and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "What? What did you say?" And he said it again. He says, "Well, I hope that man doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "Well, why would you say that? Daddy wouldn't rob a plane." And he says, yeah, I know. And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And he looked at me with this really sad face and he said, "I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that." We are living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next. Even with no malice, even with no hatred, this association between blackness and crime made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old. It makes its way into the minds of all of our children. and to all of us. Our minds are shaped by the racial disparities we see out in the world, as well as the narratives that we tell ourselves that sort of help us to make sense of what we see. Those people are criminal. Those people are violent. Those people are to be feared. We need not accept those narratives. We need not be aware of how those narratives impact us. Yet they do. In my own research, I found that simply exposing people to black faces can lead them to see blurry images of weapons with greater clarity. Bias can not only control what we see, it can control where we look. Prompting people to think of violent crime can lead us to move our eyes towards black faces and away from white faces. Prompting police officers to think of shooting or capturing or arresting leads their eyes to settle in on black faces. And although looking black is not a crime, jurors are more likely to deliver a death sentence to a black defendant who's judged to have more stereotypically black features, at least when their victims are white. Bias can not only influence our outcomes in the criminal justice system, bias can influence how teachers discipline students. For example, my colleagues and I have found that teachers express a desire to discipline black middle school students more harshly than white students for repeated infractions, even when those infractions are relatively mild. And even after just 2 strikes or 2 infractions, they can more easily imagine suspending that black student down the road. In a recent study, we found that teachers' perceptions of their students are most likely to be influenced by race when they live in regions of the country with high levels of an unconscious bias. There's a threat in the air. And that threat follows black students into schools and onto streets and into neighborhoods. It follows them as they grow older and wiser and as they enter the workplace. Whether they're attempting to secure a low-wage job after high school or an interview at a big firm after college, even as they attempt to secure funding as the head of a venture capital team, their race continues to matter. In this book, I take readers through the scientific enterprise to explain when and how and why race matters. And everywhere they go, readers not only discover scientific ideas about how the human mind works and how we interact and what it all means, they meet people. They meet people who are struggling and fighting. They meet people like Tiffany Crutcher, whose twin brother was shot and killed by a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, several years ago. Tiffany responded to that pain by dedicating her life to police reform. They meet Bernice Donald, who was one of a handful of black students to desegregate an all-white high school in Olive Branch, Mississippi in the 1960s. She endured horrific discrimination from students and teachers alike. Yet she emerged as the first black woman in the entire state of Tennessee to be appointed as a judge, and she later was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals. They meet Campbell, a white Southerner, a student at the University of Virginia who went to battle with white supremacists on the streets of Charlottesville. They came to town to start a race war. Yet there Campbell stood, defending the campus, defending the town, defending the egalitarian values that this country is still striving to embrace. And not only do the readers of Bias meet people, as I wrote this book, I met people. I was searching for information. Yet in those meetings, I was also hit with the raw pain and emotion of those people who feared they were a victim of bias. And I came to better appreciate the role and the power of science to soothe as well as to explain. As humans, we're meaning seekers. Finding answers, understanding why can provide comfort. Science can soothe. Science can also offer some direction on how to combat bias and disparities. Readers learn how the tech company Nextdoor was able to curb racial profiling on their platform, their online platform, right, by 75%. Readers learn how the Oakland Police Department was able to reduce officer-involved shootings from 8 a year to roughly 1 a year. And they did this by simply adjusting their policies in a manner that slowed officers down. Readers learn how researchers are using empathy interventions to cut school suspension rates of Black and Latinx students in half. They learn how the mere threat of bias can lead women and people of color to underperform and what can be done about it. Although racial bias can touch our lives in so many ways, we're not doomed to be under its grip. We're all vulnerable to bias, but we don't act on bias all the time. There's certain conditions that can bring bias alive, and there are certain conditions that can muffle it. Understanding the situational nature of bias can help us to curb it, not only in our individual lives, but in the systems that we build, in the policies that we create. I want to end as I began, with a story. This is a story that takes place in a prison. I was an instructor at San Quentin State Prison in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I had been an instructor at Stanford for about 12 years at that point. But there I stood in front of a class at San Quentin for the first time. It was a small class of about 25 or 30 inmates or so. And just as I had done for years at Stanford, on the very first day of class, I asked students to introduce themselves and to say why it is they wanted to take the class. Now, some of their responses were pretty similar to what I would hear from Stanford students. So, for example, they thought the course would be interesting, or they needed the credit to fulfill the requirement. That happens a lot on college campuses. But some of their responses were just responses that were just different from what I ever heard from a Stanford student. So, for example, one man was taking the course because he was worried about his daughter. He was worried that she was depressed. And he thought that by taking a psychology course, he might learn something to help her and to support her. Then another man spoke. He looked to be in his mid-40s, and I will never forget his words. He looked at me and he said, "I already know a lot about how things work here inside San Quentin." And he says to me, "I'm taking this course because I want to know how free people think." He had been incarcerated since he was 14 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life behind bars, and he was desperate to understand how imprisonment had warped his view of the world. And I was standing there before him, right? Feeling shackled by the perceptions of a society that would discard a 14-year-old. And it struck me in that moment that we were both there to move a little closer to freedom. And since that time, it struck me that so many of us are trying to move closer to freedom. This book attempts to chart a path forward, to add the armor, add to the armor of those fighting for a more just and equitable world. And I'm hopeful that this book can contribute in some small way to shifting the conversations we are having about race and inequality in this country, so that we don't slip back in time, so that we remain hopeful, so that we continue to strive to see one another, so that we continue to strive to see ourselves. Thank you.